Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. Last week, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released the final report of its Right to Read inquiry. The inquiry focused on the human rights issues affecting students with reading disabilities in the province's public school system. Accessibility reporter Meagan Gillmore attended the public release of the report and joins us now to discuss some of the recommendations and findings. Hey, good morning, Meagan.
Good morning, Dave. How are you?
I'm well. Nice to chat with you once again. So, Meagan, let's start with some of the background here. When was this inquiry launched and what were its main goals?
Okay, so I'm going to put you all in a time machine and take you back to before COVID.
Oh, gosh.
Right. This was released in October 2000. Began in October 2019. It was a really big education story here in Ontario. And before our talk public radio was filled with discussions about the pandemic, we were talking about the state of literacy and reading among school students in Ontario. So this was the first inquiry of its kind in Canada. And what the Ontario Human Rights Commission did is they brought together data analysis from public faculties of education. They analyzed information from all 13 publicly funded teachers' colleges in Ontario. They also talked to various school boards that were representative of different areas of the province. There was data from the ministry. And then there's also a lot of public consultations with parents, with groups that work with students with different sorts of reading disabilities or learning disabilities, and just places for the commission to hear from parents and teachers alike. Actually, there's some artwork in this final report that was produced by a student who participated in these sessions. And there's some very emotional material online about parents and students describing what it's like to not be able to read as well, or to watch your child go through that.
So the scope was vast.
Yes.
What were some of the main findings?
The main one, which probably shouldn't shock you if you've looked at the title of the report, is that in general, Ontario is failing to ensure that students have the right to read. So reading in this context is very much framed as a human right. And part of that, it comes from the Human Rights Commission's work on this area for years. So back in 2012, there was a Supreme Court decision called the Moore decision that dealt with Jeffrey Moore, who was a boy in Vancouver who had dyslexia and his right to an education. The Ontario Human Rights Commission was an intervener in that case, and that case really was huge in terms of the way we discuss special education and reading disabilities. This analysis, this commission's report, is kind of the next step of that. So in general, Ontario is drastically failing students. One of the main reasons that is given for that has to do with how students are taught to read. And much of the current methods that are used to teach children how to read, the inquiry's final report would argue those are not based in science. They're not actually effective. So they're typically methods that focus on, teaching students to read or to guess words by looking at the context surrounding the word. So if there's a picture or like the sentence, and maybe not necessarily actually looking at the word itself and the letters and the sounds and how a word is constructed.
That is interesting, the science of learning. So
Yes.
Let's drill into some more specific areas here in regards to the recommendations. Let's begin with curriculum and instruction, which I believe you were alluding to a little bit right there.
Right. So, and there are just broad strokes. There are 157 recommendations. If you've been following our reports, you know that there's always hundreds of recommendations once this comes out.
So we'll scrap the rest of the show, Meagan, and you're just gonna run through them one point at a time.
I'm just going to read them all. We'll get Mike Ross to do some voiceover work. So there's a big section about curriculum and instruction, and the big one, divided into several subpoints, is that we need curriculum to be revised. We need reading curriculum to be revised, overhauled, specifically kindergarten and grades 1 to 8 curriculum need to be changed. And what the Ontario Human Rights Commission is recommending is that they remove references to things like cueing and replace that with mandatory, explicit, systemic, and direct instruction and foundational reading skills, which would include things like phonetics and awareness of how words sound and the ability to decode words, decode letter sounds and figure out a word that way. So from the actual sounds of a word and the sound arrangements of phonetics. And the main goal is to help students learn how to read accurately and quickly in the future, right? So we give students the tools that help them in later years when they find a word that they don't know what it is, and there may not be like a picture, or there may not be a lot of context around this word, that you have the skills that you need to figure out what those letters are saying and what the word is in front of you.
As you described this, Meagan, I can't even recall learning to read and what that experience was like for me in school. So it's so fascinating to sort of look back through the eyes of this report and consider that and try to have little flashes. But what about recommendations in regards to early screening and intervention?
The report is recommending that school boards are required to screen all students twice a year, at the beginning of the school year and then in the middle of the year, from kindergarten to grade 2. So one of the concerns that this report raised was that there's not effective early screening or early intervention. And by the time that the school boards are going to make a program available to a student who's struggling in reading, the student is further along in their elementary school curriculum and journey. So you've missed that key early intervention time with students. So that, of course, leads into recommendations about the Ministry of Education providing stable and yearly funding for interventions. And that early intervention should target those foundational skills that they're saying need to be explicitly included in the curriculum. So skills like phonetic awareness, sound letter knowledge, so knowing like what sound does a letter make, decoding and word reading accuracy and fluency. And that the ministry should work with external experts to mandate and standardize evidence-based eligibility criteria to receive reading interventions, so that there is, because it varies from where you are in the province, school board to school board, even sometimes school from school, who gets assessments, who gets intervention, who gets help to learn to read. There's a recommendation that all that be more standardized to do that, and that there should not be a psychoeducational assessment as a precondition for receiving an evidence-based reading intervention.
What about some recommendations for students with disabilities?
Right. This is where it gets really interesting. And Dave, I know you love to talk about definitions of disability.
I do.
This comes up here. So one of the main observations in this report is that Ontario's education system only uses the term learning disability in its descriptions of different reasons why students may be struggling to read or to learn. And as I'm sure our audience is very aware, the term learning disability is incredibly broad. So that doesn't really capture the specifics of different students and what is causing them to struggle to read. So the report recommends that the terms reading disability and dyslexia be used, and that dyslexia in particular be used explicitly. So the report talks about that although dyslexia is assumed to be neurobiological in origin, there is evidence that with evidence-based reading instruction, early identification, and early evidence-based reading intervention, at-risk students will not develop a quote-unquote disability. If the education system is working as it should, a reading disability can be prevented for almost all students. And that's really one of the foundational beliefs of this report, is that the majority of students are capable of learning to read well and learning to read efficiently. We do need to take into account the various socioeconomic backgrounds that they're coming from, their cultural backgrounds. There's several recommendations that are related to Indigenous education for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students in Ontario's education system. But given all that, students can learn to read. And if you assume that a student with a particular disability or with dyslexia can't learn to read, that may be an ableist assumption. There's ways that you can change your teaching strategies and teach them effectively.
Meagan, a lot of this analysis appears to be around sort of the visual component of looking at letters and then figuring out the phonetic sounds. What about some analysis for people who might be legally blind or totally blind who are learning to read in alternative formats?
Right. So this report does, if you go through the full report, it does briefly mention that students with visual impairments may face additional barriers in literacy. And the report does reference concerns that have been raised by the AODA Alliance and Views for the Visually Impaired OPVIC, formerly Views for the Visually Impaired, about the quality of education that teachers receive to be specialized low vision teachers. So there's been concerns raised for several years. We've discussed them on this program about if there is appropriate training for teachers to teach students with visual impairments in the public system. That concern is raised again in this report. The commission did hear about that. However, this report does not go into full details about what that would look like or what more of the specific challenges that students with low vision are facing.
And what happens now?
Yeah, so I guess right now it's a hurry up and wait game. Obviously, rehauling curriculum is a big project, and the commission wants this done right away. But they also want it done in a substantial and comprehensive way.
Yeah.
So it's.
Do you want it done right or do you want it done fast? We want both.
Right. We want them right now. And they got a point. Reading is crucial.
Fundamental. Foundational.
It's foundational. You can make arguments about poverty. You can make arguments about the criminal justice system based on somebody's ability to read. So we're waiting to see if the government of Ontario is going to take them up on the need to revise the curriculum. There is an election coming up this year. And also waiting to see how faculties of education, so teachers' colleges, are going to respond. One of the big critiques is that teachers are not trained to teach students to read properly, and that the ways that we're teaching teachers to teach aren't based in science, aren't actually proper, and they're setting students up for failure before they really even get started.
Meagan, this whole segment, I've been trying to rack my brain in regards to learning to read, and I made reference to it before. And I wonder if I'm having so much trouble because there were so many teachers in my life. My nana was a teacher, my great aunt was a teacher, almost all my aunts were teachers. So I get the impression that I was maybe being taught to read from such a young age that I can't even remember. But you said you reflect a little bit on your experience learning to read. So
today's International Women's Day. My kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Robinson, I believe, she was amazing. She was incredibly patient with me, and like you, I grew up around teachers. My dad's a teacher. I'm the youngest, so like my siblings were reading. But I do remember having a very hard time with some of my letter sounds, and I had to go to speech therapy. And I couldn't do the L. I could not do L sounds to save anybody's life. And I remember the first time I read a sentence, the cat lapped up the milk. That was the first time I said L properly. And my teacher was thrilled and just made me stand at the board and repeat the sentence over and over again. Like, she was really good at like writing big and like letting me walk up as close as I needed to and all those things. But I remember like, as a 5-year-old being a little confused about like, yes, the cat lapped up the milk. Why is this such a big deal? Why don't you say this? I don't understand. But yeah, I remember the flashcards. I had teachers who were really big on phonics, on tracing letters. And, being concerned that I had the right thickness of pencil to be able to see my letters that I was tracing, all those things. But yes, I would not be able to read if it was not for the patience and the skill of a very talented teacher. And I really loved reading. I really liked it. I think that also is another question that I don't know if this report really gets into, is how do you also instill in students a love for literacy, and for words, and for the world building that happens when you learn language.
Yeah, the sparks that go off in your mind when you have the opportunity to spend some time with a good book, absolutely through and through. Hey, Meagan, thank you for jumping in a little bit early today. We appreciate it. Have yourself a great day, and we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV, or download the podcasts wherever you listen. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen.